Full story, from silent to bold. The transformation that shocked her family and changed everything. Welcome to Silent Wars. In today's video, we're diving into a full story about a woman who overcame years of feeling invisible and unimportant in her family. This journey of self-discovery and transformation will inspire you to embrace your true worth and never settle for being overlooked. If you enjoy this full story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Wars for more empowering content. For as long as I can remember, I was the quiet one in my family, the one who was always there, but never really seen. At 27, I've had time to reflect on how those early years shaped who I became. Family gatherings were a constant reminder of my invisibility. Whether it was a holiday, a birthday, or a family dinner, I would end up on the fringes, sitting near the food table, half listening to conversations that didn't include me. It was like I was just a fixture, blending into the background while everyone else had their moments in the spotlight. My cousins were always the stars. They were loud, lively, and dressed to impress. They had the perfect hair, the flashy outfits, and the inside jokes that made them inseparable. I always admired their ability to command attention, but at the same time, I felt completely invisible. It wasn't just the way they acted. It was the way the rest of the family treated me. They didn't mean to ignore me, but it was as if my presence didn't matter. I was just there. I was just quiet. I was the background noise to their lives. I remember one particular moment from my childhood, one that still stings to this day. I was 13 years old at my uncle's anniversary party, standing awkwardly by the dessert table, trying to hide in plain sight. I was desperate to blend in, to not be noticed, but it never worked. My aunt, the one who never held back her opinion, glanced at me as I stood there, a shadow against the backdrop of laughter and clinking glasses. Without missing a beat, she turned to my mom and said, "It's like she doesn't have a personality." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my face flush with embarrassment as everyone around us laughed. It wasn't a laugh that made me feel included. It was the kind of laugh that made me feel like I was the joke. And in that moment, I felt as though I had been reduced to nothing more than a punchline. I stood there frozen, trying to shrink even further into the background. I wanted to disappear. The laughter, the comment, everything about that moment made me feel like I was too much of an afterthought to ever truly belong. It was a feeling I carried with me for years, a quiet resentment that built up every time I was passed over in favor of someone more vibrant, someone who commanded attention without even trying. I wasn't loud or outgoing. I didn't have the perfect outfit or the quick wit to make people laugh. I was just there. It wasn't that I didn't try to fit in. It was that no one ever really gave me the chance to. As I grew older, the feeling of being invisible only deepened. When I was in college, I began to withdraw from family events altogether. It wasn't that I didn't love them or want to be a part of their lives. It was that I had come to accept that I wasn't welcome. I wasn't the type of person they valued. I wasn't the center of attention, and they didn't seem to care that I wanted to be. I stopped attending the birthday parties, the family dinners, and the gatherings that once held some semblance of hope for me. I thought I could just fade away, quietly removing myself from their lives as they had done to me. But in doing so, I learned something important about myself. I realized that the way I felt in those moments wasn't a reflection of who I was. It was a reflection of how I had let myself be treated. I had allowed myself to be invisible because I thought that was what I deserved. But the truth was, I didn't need to be invisible anymore. I didn't need to sit on the sidelines, waiting for someone to notice me. Over time, I began to build my own sense of identity. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was necessary. I wasn't going to let those years of being forgotten define me. The laughter, the comments, The feeling of not being seen, it was all part of my past, but it didn't have to be my future. For the first time in my life, I started to see my own worth. And while I still carry the memories of being the quiet one, the invisible one, I now know that I'm not invisible anymore. I don't need anyone's approval to take up space in this world. I've learned that I don't have to shrink to make room for others. I am enough, just as I am. As the years passed, the pattern remained unchanged. I was always the one who was left out. The family events I longed to be a part of were never meant for me. Birthdays, graduations, anniversaries. Those milestones were for everyone except me. I remember my cousin Maya's sweet 16 party like it was yesterday. I wasn't invited, of course, and I wasn't even surprised. It wasn't that I didn't care about her or want to celebrate with her. It was that, once again, I wasn't included in their world. When my mom found out, she went into overdrive. She called up my aunt, guilt-tripping her into adding me to the guest list at the last minute. She should be there, my mom insisted. It's family. At first, I thought it might be nice. Maybe this time things would be different. But when I walked into the party, it hit me. I was the last-minute addition, the pity guest, the one people only invited because they didn't want to seem rude. It wasn't a warm welcome, it was more of a forced smile, a quick hello, and then the awkward silence as people turned back to their conversations. I knew I wasn't wanted there. I hated that feeling, the feeling of being a charity invite. I wasn't part of the group. I was just there to fill a spot. The same thing happened again and again. My cousin's graduation dinner was another example. No invite. But when my mom found out, she again made a fuss. She called, she emailed, and within an hour, I received a last-minute invite. They were doing me a favor, but I could tell they didn't want me there. I hated the pity that followed those invites, and the weight of their forced generosity hung over me like a dark cloud. I wasn't wanted, but I was invited out of obligation, not affection. It's funny, in a sad way, how people can make you feel more invisible by pretending to do the right thing. My family didn't seem to realize the hurt they caused by inviting me out of guilt. By the time I reached college, I had enough. No more pity invites, no more pretending. I simply stopped going to family events altogether. There was no confrontation, no big argument, it was just silence. I didn't fight with anyone. I just stopped participating. After years of being an afterthought, I decided to take myself out of the equation. I would no longer put myself in a position where I was unwanted and unloved. But silence doesn't always last, does it? One day, it broke. I was walking past the campus cafe when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. It was my cousin Sarah, standing outside with a friend, and I overheard her say something that hit me harder than any exclusion ever could. "She'll ruin the vibe, so we won't invite her to the party." Those words, simple, cruel, and so casual, were the final straw. In that moment, I knew. I didn't have to keep trying. I didn't have to fight for a place in a family that had never truly made room for me. That was it. That was the moment I decided to cut ties with everyone. I didn't need their pity anymore, and I certainly didn't need their fake invitations. The hurt, the resentment, and the feeling of being invisible had built up for far too long, and that moment, overhearing Sarah's words, was my breaking point. So, I left. I stopped attending family gatherings. I stopped pretending. The silence became my shield, and it was the best decision I ever made. I no longer needed to force myself into a place where I wasn't wanted. From that moment on, I decided to create my own life, and I didn't need anyone's pity to do it. For years, I had carried the weight of resentment, and it had become part of me. It was as though my identity had been defined by the rejection and neglect I felt in my family, and I didn't know who I was without it. The pain had woven itself so deeply into my life that I had become accustomed to it. I wasn't sure how to break free from it, but in the silence that followed my decision to cut ties with my family, I found something unexpected: a chance to change. The first step was the gym. At first, I didn't think it would make a difference. I wasn't looking to become someone I wasn't. I wasn't chasing a perfect body or an unrealistic ideal of beauty. I was looking for something more, a way to channel my pain into something productive, a way to transform my mindset. It started with the basics, just walking on the treadmill, moving my body in ways that felt foreign to me. The weights seemed heavy, and every rep felt like it took everything I had. But with every drop of sweat, something began to change. The physical transformation was slow at first. I wasn't seeing dramatic results, but I could feel the shift happening inside me. With each workout, I began to feel stronger, not just in my body, but in my mind. I felt a sense of control, of agency that I had never felt before. As the weeks went on, I found myself standing a little taller. My posture changed, and with it, my self-esteem. I could look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by the past. I wasn't just the invisible one anymore. I was becoming someone who could take up space. But physical strength was only part of the battle. The mental and emotional side was much harder to tackle. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth, trying to fit into a family that never really understood me. The silence had been deafening, and I had used it to bury all my feelings of inadequacy. I thought that if I could change, if I could become someone more acceptable, then maybe I would finally earn love and acceptance. But as I worked through these feelings, I realized something: no amount of change could make me worthy of love if I didn't love myself first. That's when I started therapy. Initially, I thought I would go for just a few sessions, maybe unpack a couple of things here and there. But what I found was a deep and ongoing journey. We talked about everything: the guilt I carried from all those years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, the self-doubt that clouded my every decision, and the belief that I had to change myself to earn the love I craved. The therapist helped me see that I didn't need to change who I was. I needed to accept who I was. I didn't have to keep striving for approval from others. I just needed to learn to stand tall on my own. It wasn't easy. It was painful. And there were times I didn't know if I could continue. But the longer I worked through my emotions, the more I realized that I wasn't the sum of my family's opinions. I wasn't someone who needed to be invited to prove my worth. I was becoming someone who could walk into a room without needing validation. I started to build the person I had always wanted to be, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was enough. I wasn't waiting for anyone to approve of me anymore. I was living for myself, learning to love myself, and embracing the person I had become. I wasn't the invisible one anymore. I wasn't the one who waited in the corner for someone to notice me. I was standing in the center of my own life, confident, strong, and unafraid. And that, in itself, was the greatest transformation of all. After years of silence, I never expected anything to change. I had made peace with the idea of being left out, of not being included in family matters. But then, one day, I got a text message that made my heart skip a beat. It was from Sarah, my cousin, who had always been a part of the group. The text was simple, but the words hit me harder than I expected. "Everyone's invited to the family reunion," she wrote, "but there's a catch. You need to be bold, beautiful, and confident." At first, I laughed. It felt like a joke, some kind of mockery. I couldn't help but wonder if they were just inviting me to check a box, to say they'd included me, but with no real intention of welcoming me. Was this an attempt to make me feel like an outsider even more? The past had trained me to expect little from my family, and I thought, why would this time be any different? But then, something unexpected happened. I stopped myself. I paused, staring at the screen for a moment, and then I thought, Why not? For so long, I had been waiting for their approval, for their acknowledgement that I mattered. I spent years trying to fit into a mold that they never asked me to be in, hoping for invitations, hoping to be seen. But this time, I realized I didn't need their approval. I didn't need them to give me permission to belong. This was my moment to make a choice. I had built myself up from the ground up, and I wasn't going to shrink away from this opportunity. I texted back with one simple sentence: "I'll be there." I didn't think twice. I didn't second-guess myself. I wasn't going to be the quiet one hiding in the background anymore. I wasn't going to be the person who waited for someone else to make room for me. No more waiting. No more hesitation. I was showing up for myself. The day of the reunion arrived, and I drove alone to the venue. It was a family estate, tucked away in the hills, surrounded by sprawling lawns and stone walls that seemed to whisper of old family stories. I could feel the nerves in my stomach, but they weren't the same nervousness I once felt when I'd show up at family events, unsure of my place. This was different. This time, I wasn't coming to beg for a seat at the table. I was coming to own my space. I'd picked out a sleek navy jumpsuit, a simple but bold choice. I added oversized sunglasses, the kind that screamed confidence without saying a word. And to make a statement, I rented a fancy car. It wasn't because I needed it. I didn't need the car to impress anyone. But I knew that this reunion was going to be a spectacle. They had asked me to be bold, beautiful, and confident, so I was going to deliver. When I arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting a warm golden glow over everything. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed the reactions immediately. My relatives, those familiar faces I had known all my life, stared in shock. I could see the disbelief in their eyes as they processed the version of me standing before them. The shy, invisible girl they once knew was now gone. In her place stood someone who was unapologetically herself. The gasps were subtle, but they were there. I locked eyes with a few of my cousins, their mouths hanging open as they tried to figure out who this new person was. It was a surreal moment. It was in that instant, as the sun set behind the hills and I felt the warmth of the moment wash over me, that I realized things had changed. I wasn't going to be ignored anymore. They were going to see me now, not as the quiet one, but as someone who had the strength to show up, to be seen, and to take up space. And that was only the beginning. As I stepped into the estate, something inside me shifted. I wasn't nervous or unsure, as I would have been in the past. This time, I walked in like I owned the place. The grand stone walls, the sweeping lawns, the fancy decor, they all felt like they were part of my world now. It wasn't just the beautiful venue. It was the energy I brought with me. For the first time, I was in control, not just of my surroundings, but of how I was seen. I immediately caught the eye of my cousin Maya. Her eyes widened as she looked at me, her expression one of disbelief, as though she couldn't quite comprehend who I had become. I could almost hear her thoughts. Is that really her? But I didn't stop to explain. I didn't need to. I walked past her with my head held high, walking in like I belonged, not just as a guest but as someone who had earned a place at this table. The transformation was visible, but it wasn't just physical. It wasn't just the sleek jumpsuit or the perfectly styled hair. It was the confidence in my every step. My presence, my energy, commanded attention in a way it never had before. I had been the quiet one, the one who slipped into the background, the one whose existence was barely acknowledged. But not anymore. This time, I wasn't the awkward cousin hiding near the food or sitting at the edge of the table. I was the one people couldn't ignore. The compliments started almost immediately. "Wow, you look amazing," my uncle said, his voice still tinged with surprise. He looked at me as though he couldn't quite figure out when I had changed, when I had gone from the quiet girl to the confident woman standing in front of him. But it wasn't just my appearance that caught their attention, it was the change in my demeanor, the way I carried myself, the way I stood tall and looked people in the eye. I wasn't shrinking back anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to make space for me. I was taking up space on my own terms. For years, I had been invisible, fading into the background at every family gathering. But now, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. It wasn't the kind of attention that made me uncomfortable or self-conscious, it was the kind of attention that felt empowering. I was no longer the girl everyone overlooked. I wasn't the one who quietly watched from the sidelines while my cousins and relatives took center stage. I was the one everyone was watching now. I felt a rush of validation, but it wasn't the kind of validation I had been waiting for all those years. It wasn't the approval of my family. It was the validation I had given myself by showing up as my authentic self. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't seeking approval. I was simply being me, bold, confident, and unapologetic. And for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was a strange feeling, to be the center of attention in a room full of people who had once barely noticed me. But it wasn't just the attention that felt different, it was the way I stood in it. I wasn't uncomfortable or overwhelmed. I didn't need to deflect or shrink away. I was finally comfortable in my own skin, and that made all the difference. As the evening went on, I realized something. The shift wasn't just in how my family saw me. The shift had already happened inside me. I wasn't the same person who had walked into the room. I had transformed into someone who could walk in, own the space, and demand respect. Not because I was perfect, but because I finally respected myself. And that respect radiated outward. Dinner that night started off as any family gathering would. The usual small talk, the clinking of glasses, and the polite smiles exchanged across the table. But as the evening unfolded, I could feel the energy shift. It wasn't the kind of comfortable atmosphere I had hoped for, where people would simply enjoy each other's company. It quickly became clear that my presence, my newfound confidence, was beginning to unsettle some of my relatives. I had been holding my own for most of the evening, engaging with a few cousins and sharing the usual light-hearted banter. But then I decided to tell a story. It wasn't a story I planned to make a big deal of. It was just something that happened at work, a challenging project that my team had almost failed, but we managed to turn it around and impress a major client. I told the story casually, as though it were just another day at the office, but something changed as I spoke. The room fell silent. For the first time in years, I noticed that people were actually listening. My cousins, who once barely acknowledged me, were now hanging on every word I said. I could feel their eyes on me, some of them exchanging glances. Were they jealous? Was there an undercurrent of resentment? Or was it simple curiosity? At first, it felt good. It felt like I was being seen, like I mattered. But as the evening wore on, the smiles became more strained. The polite, rehearsed laughter that usually filled the room began to slip, replaced by awkward silences and forced chuckles. I could feel the tension mounting. It was as if my family didn't quite know what to do with me anymore. I wasn't the quiet, invisible cousin they were used to. Now, I was a presence they had to reckon with, and that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, Priya, my cousin, who had always been the one to dominate conversations, knocked over her drink onto my bag. The drink spilled with a loud splat, and I looked down to see the dark stain spreading across the fabric. I expected some sort of apology, even a half-hearted one, but instead, she just stared at me. No words, no regret. She didn't even attempt to help clean it up. I felt the heat rise to my face, a mix of frustration and confusion. How could she not even say sorry? But before I could say anything, Seeman, my youngest cousin, jumped in. She grabbed a napkin and started dabbing at the stain, trying to help me as best she could. It wasn't lost on me that Simon, the one who had always looked up to me, was the only one to offer genuine help. The rest of my relatives just watched. It was clear now Priya was not happy that I was taking up space in this family dynamic. Her casual disregard for my belongings spoke volumes. I was no longer the quiet cousin who would fade into the background. I had come into my own, and it made her uncomfortable. She had been the one who was always in control, always the center of attention, and now that role was slipping from her grasp. But instead of retreating, I stood taller. I refused to let her or anyone else push me back into the shadows. Priya may have tried to undermine me, but the more she did, the stronger I became. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to react. The moment I stopped allowing her actions to affect me, I won. I smiled, nodded at Simon for her help, and focused on the conversation again, choosing to not let the awkwardness disrupt my newfound sense of self. The evening went on, but I could feel the power shift. This time, I wasn't the one shrinking. I wasn't the invisible one anymore. The more they tried to make me feel small, the more I realized how far I had come. I wasn't going to let anyone dim my light. Not Priya, not anyone. I was done with being ignored, and that night, I made sure everyone knew it. The next day, the tension in the air was palpable. You could feel it as soon as I stepped into the room. The family reunion, which had started with tentative smiles and cautious pleasantries, was starting to take on a different energy. I could sense the whispers. Priya, along with a few of my other cousins, was quietly exchanging glances. I could see their eyes narrowing, their conversations flicking toward me as if I wasn't supposed to notice. They were trying to figure out how to handle the new me, the version of me who wasn't shrinking into the background anymore. It wasn't subtle. The comments began to fly, disguised as casual chatter, but there was an edge to them. "So, how's your career going?" Priya asked with a tilt of her head, her voice laced with skepticism. "Must be nice, being a consultant. Do you even know what you're doing?" Her tone was casual, but the underlying question was clear. She didn't believe I was capable of the career I had built for myself. It wasn't the first time I had been doubted. In fact, it wasn't even the second or third. But this time was different. I wasn't that quiet girl anymore, the one who would fold under the weight of others' judgment. No, this time I was unbothered. I wasn't going to let their questions or their doubts unsettle me. So, I did the unexpected. I didn't react with defensiveness or anger. Instead, I calmly started to break down my job title for them. "I'm a project manager at a boutique consulting firm," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I help companies align their brand strategies with their business goals, particularly in the tech sector." I could see them struggling to process this. They weren't used to me speaking with such confidence, but I wasn't finished. I leaned into the conversation, sharing some of the projects I had worked on, detailing how my team had pulled off a high-stakes campaign for a major tech client. Then, I did something I knew would make them uncomfortable. I pulled up my company's LinkedIn profile on my phone. "You can check out the team and our work anytime," I said, showing them the profile. The faces around me shifted. I noticed my uncle glance at the screen, his eyes widening as he saw the company's name and the key players listed, including my boss, an industry veteran with years of experience working with top-tier companies. The look on their faces was priceless. Priya, who had once made me feel like I was out of place, suddenly looked speechless. The others, who had doubted me from the start, were suddenly silent. I could feel the shift in the room. For the first time in years, I wasn't the quiet one anymore. I wasn't the one they could dismiss or belittle. They couldn't ignore me. They couldn't pretend I didn't exist. And for the first time, I realized something important. I had earned my place at the table, not just because of my job or my achievements, but because I finally learned to stop apologizing for being myself. Priya, who had always been the center of attention, was now left at a loss for words. Her usual sharp retorts and dismissive comments had nowhere to go. She had no more ammunition. And the best part? I didn't need to say a word to prove anything. My confidence, my calm demeanor, and my refusal to flinch spoke for me. I wasn't the awkward cousin in the corner anymore. I was the one who stood tall, unbothered by the whispers or the doubts that used to follow me. It felt empowering to know that I had built myself up so much that their opinions no longer had power over me. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. The weekend had been filled with awkward encounters and strained smiles, but it reached its peak when I decided to host a game night. I had no expectations, no plans to prove anything, just a desire to take control of my own space and create a fun, light-hearted environment where people could let their guard down. To my surprise, people actually showed up, eager to participate. At first, I was hesitant. This wasn't a typical family event. I wasn't the one who organized it. I hadn't been the one to plan every detail, like everyone else always did. But that night, for the first time in years, I wasn't going to let someone else dictate the mood or the tone. I set up a few games, laid out snacks, and just let things happen organically. There was no need for a speech or for forced laughter. We played simple card games, laughed at silly jokes, and shared stories. And slowly, the atmosphere shifted. What struck me was how much fun it was. The room was filled with laughter, but this time it wasn't hollow or forced. It was genuine. People were talking, laughing, and enjoying themselves without trying to compete for attention or approval. For once, the energy in the room wasn't controlled by Priya or anyone else. She wasn't the center of the room anymore, and that felt like a small but powerful victory. But as the night wore on, I noticed Priya standing off to the side, watching me. She had tried to join in a few times, but each time, the group had already formed its own rhythm, its own dynamic. She was met with silence, the kind of silence that happens when someone who is used to being in control suddenly realizes they no longer have that power. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't as though anyone was intentionally ignoring her. It was simply that the dynamic had shifted, and she wasn't in charge anymore. The real shock came when one of my aunts pulled me aside in the middle of the game. She had been watching the group all evening, and there was something different in her eyes. She smiled, her expression sincere, and said, "You know, I've been thinking. Have you ever considered doing media work? You've got an incredible presence. The way people gravitate toward you, the way you carry yourself, it's magnetic." Her words took me by surprise. It wasn't just a compliment about how I looked or how I had dressed. It was a compliment about my energy, my essence. It was the first time someone had acknowledged that I wasn't just a passive participant in my own life anymore. I wasn't the shy, quiet cousin in the background. I had presence, and people were noticing. I looked over at Priya. Her face had gone pale. For the first time that weekend, she didn't have a retort. She didn't have a comeback. She froze, her eyes darting between me and my aunt, trying to process the fact that I was no longer the one who was invisible. She had always been the one who commanded attention, the one who made everyone laugh, the one who controlled the narrative. But now, it was my turn. Priya didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. She tried to re-enter the group, but it was clear that her role in the family had been diminished. The spotlight had shifted, and for once, I wasn't the one left in the dark. As the night went on, I reveled in the simplicity of the moment. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about outshining anyone else. It was about showing up as myself, unapologetically, and owning the space I had once been afraid to claim. And in that moment, I realized something important. The power had always been in my hands. I just needed to stop waiting for permission to take it. As the reunion slowly came to a close, something had shifted in the air, something I hadn't fully expected. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just tolerated anymore, I was a part of the family dynamic. Whether they liked it or not, I was no longer the quiet cousin on the sidelines, the one who barely existed in their eyes. I had shown up, I had taken my space, and for the first time, my family couldn't ignore me. Even Sarah, who had remained neutral throughout the weekend, pulled me aside as the reunion wound down. She smiled, a genuine smile, and thanked me for showing up. "I'm really glad you came," she said, her voice sincere. "You didn't let anyone silence you. That takes courage. I admire that." Hearing those words from Sarah, someone I had once felt so distant from, felt like a quiet victory. I wasn't seeking approval from anyone anymore, but hearing her acknowledgement felt like the final piece falling into place. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting for my place in the family. I belonged. The final day of the reunion was marked by an eerie quiet. Everyone was starting to go through the motions, the weekend coming to a close. It wasn't exactly tension, but it was different, a shift, an understanding that things weren't the same as they were before. The dynamic had changed, and while it felt peaceful on the surface, I knew it was the calm before the storm. As expected, Priya couldn't leave without one last jab. Throughout the weekend, she had thrown subtle barbs, trying to undermine me, trying to remind everyone of the version of me she used to know, the quiet, invisible cousin who was never quite a part of the group. And so, at the final brunch, as the last bit of food was served and the conversation was winding down, Priya leaned in, trying to revive some old story. She was attempting to remind everyone of my past awkwardness, the way I used to hide in the shadows, the way I wasn't quite good enough to fit in. "Remember when she couldn't even make eye contact at family events?" Priya said with a smirk, her voice dripping with the kind of dismissive tone I had grown so used to. But before she could finish, one of the older aunts, who had watched everything unfold, spoke up. "What matters is who people become," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a beacon of clarity. "Not who they were at 13. The room went silent for a moment. The words hung there, but they weren't just words, they were a declaration, an unspoken truth that resonated with everyone at the table. Slowly, heads nodded in agreement. The energy shifted again, and this time, it was clear that Priya's attempt to undermine me had failed. Her words had lost their power. I had changed, but not for them. I didn't do it to prove anything to my family or anyone else. I had changed for me. I had fought my own battles, found my own voice, and stopped waiting for validation from people who had never really seen me. I didn't need their approval anymore to know my worth. I had already recognized it within myself. And in that moment, I realized that no one could take that away from me. Not Priya, not anyone. The rest of the day was a blur of goodbyes and quiet smiles. As people started packing up, there was a strange peace in the air. I wasn't the same person who had arrived at that reunion a few days ago. I had walked in uncertain, but I was leaving confident, strong, and with a sense of self I had never fully embraced before. And no one, not even Priya, could ever make me shrink back into the shadows again. In life, we often find ourselves in situations where we feel overlooked, undervalued, or ignored, especially within our families or communities. The story highlights an important lesson. Personal growth begins when we stop waiting for others to validate us. The protagonist's journey reflects the power of embracing self-worth, shedding past insecurities, and refusing to be defined by the opinions of others. It teaches us that true confidence comes not from external approval, but from understanding and accepting ourselves. For those of us who have experienced years of feeling invisible or undervalued, It's never too late to change the narrative. We have the power to rewrite our stories, to step into rooms with our heads held high, not seeking permission to exist, but simply being. As we age, we may find ourselves reflecting on past struggles or regrets, but it's important to remember that our worth is not tied to our past mistakes or the judgments of others. What truly matters is who we choose to become in the present. Embracing the present moment and recognizing our value allows us to build a life of fulfillment, peace, and respect. It's a reminder that we are worthy of respect, love, and the freedom to live authentically no matter our age. The power to live fully rests within us. It is never too late to reclaim our voice and stand strong in our identity. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this full story has inspired you to embrace your own journey of growth and self-worth. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to Silent Wars so you never miss an empowering story. See you in the next video.